Massachusetts was declared in full rebellion in 1775. This would lead to the garrison in Boston to attempt to disarm and regain control before any real combat could begin. The expedition was led by one Francis Smith. They marched through the night to try and catch the rebels by surprise, but unknowingly to them, they were announced by three messengers, famously Paul Revere, but also Prescott and Dowes. Dowes and Paul would be captured at Lexington, but Prescott slips through the British patrols and makes his way to Concord just in time. With everyone alerted, there would be a struggle for the arms at Concord. Early in the morning of April 17th, a group of militia held their ground upon their green. When the British arrived, the men must have been terrified and prepared for the worst. The two stood in that field for what probably felt like an eternity, but then there was a call to fire. The militia's line lied decimated. The shots heard around the world had been fired, and the revolution had begun. After obliterating the militia at Lexington, the British moved on to Concord and found no weapons. The rebels had moved then, thanks to Prescott. On their march back to Boston, they suffered heavy losses due to American skirmishers harassing and opening fire onto them. The provisional commander at the time for the militia, George Washington, placed the guns the British were looking for atop the hills outside of Boston, starting what would later be known as the Siege of Boston. The siege was brutally effective and scared the British for a few solid days, but military action needed to be taken. So on June 17th, after reinforcements arrived, the commander of the besieged Boston forces, Thomas Gage, began a breakout attempt at the Battle of Bunker Hill, which was fought on Breed's Hill. The battle would be a sobering moment for many of the new revolutionaries. The British seemed to have no regard for their own safety and marched on the hill almost 3 times, taking massive amounts of casualties. Almost a fourth of their reinforcements, or around 1,000 men, had died. Only a day after this defeat, George Washington would become the commander-in-chief. That winter, not much would occur due to the forces on each side taking the winter off. By spring of 1776, the British were completely expelled from Boston and its surrounding areas. In July of the same year, British forces landed at New York and blasted the Continentals at the Battle of Brooklyn. Seeing the potential this victory had for crushing patriot morale, they requested a meeting to try and end the colonial uprising. The Continentals denied any form of peace. After fleeing New York City and letting the city fall into British hands, George Washington allowed his army to stay intact and ready to fight another day. New Jersey would also fall, but Washington would famously cross the Delaware River into New Jersey and surprise attack them at Princeton and Trenton, succeeding in both attacks. The victories in New Jersey would also keep the army in good spirits, especially after a string of many defeats in New York. Burgoyne's forces attempted to invade New England and cut it off from the rest of the colonies in rebellion. In a series of almost hilarious miscommunications, the Southern Army, who was to link up with Burgoyne, decided they would chill in New York instead of attack. This led Burgoyne failing in his mission and would convince Cornwallis that they needed to go somewhere else. In 1778, a fundamental change for the British's plan to win the war was enacted. They would begin the push south, where they believed more loyalists lived, which was partially true. During the winter of 78, the British took control of Savannah, as well as the entire Georgian coastline. This meant trouble for the colonies, and Charlestown would soon follow. With Georgia and South Carolina firmly in the hands of the British, they began to set up a system of forts, relying on loyalist turnout to man them. Subsequently, too few loyalists showed up, and the Southern Front resembled Viet Cong-style guerrilla warfare. 1779 did not see much major combat between the Continentals and British Army, and was mostly made up of large guerrilla attacks. Though outside of the Americas, Spain would declare war on the British, though not to help the colonies but for other financial reasons. New York forces would also push the hostile natives out. This year also saw Phillipsburg Proclamation announced, which allowed black men in bondage freedom if they were to serve the British Army. In 1780, the French would assist the colonists in their war efforts, effectively bringing in the Dutch and Spanish as well. In June, the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse would commence. It saw the stalemate in the north solidify, and would be the last major battle in the north. The siege of Yorktown would commence after Cornwallis moved into a nearby peninsula, believing a fleet would be coming to rescue them. This fleet would never arrive due to being battered by the French in the Chesapeake and retreating to New York. This effectively left Cornwallis trapped inside of the peninsula, and believing he had no other choice, especially with the sight of the French fleet, he surrendered to the colonists besieging him. This major defeat would see the British public completely turn away from continued warfare, and would have the British Parliament seeking peace. The Americans would not see peace through treaty until 2 years after the surrender at Yorktown, at the Paris Peace Conference and its subsequent treaty. That treaty allowed the Americans to move past the Appalachians, and the British abandoned all allies in North America. The treaty also ensured loyalist protection. The French were also left in a large debt with no benefits. The treaty also included that the British would no longer maintain forts in the American territories and stop supplying natives. Neither was stopped until 1795 with the Jay Treaty. I hope you found this series valuable. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. If you think I did good, why not leave a like or perhaps subscribe? Have a wonderful day.